He thought it was just another routine stop, until a child's voice changed everything. The late afternoon sun cast long golden shadows across the elementary school parking lot in Arlington, Virginia, where minivans lined up in neat rows and parents checked their watches as the final bell echoed faintly through the building, signaling the end of another ordinary school day. And among them stood Marcus Reed, dressed in a simple navy button-down and dark jeans, blending in like any other father waiting to pick up his child. His posture relaxed, but his eyes attentive, scanning the entrance with quiet anticipation as children began pouring out in waves of laughter and chatter, backpacks bouncing, sneakers squeaking against the pavement, until finally a small figure broke through the crowd with unmistakable excitement. "Dad!" Ethan Reed shouted, his voice bright and full of life as he sprinted forward, arms wide. And Marcus knelt slightly just in time to catch him in a warm embrace, the kind that erased the weight of the day in a single moment. "Hey, buddy," Marcus said softly, a faint smile forming as he ruffled Ethan's hair. "How was school?" Ethan pulled back just enough to look up at him, eyes shining. "I got an A on my math test," he said proudly, and for a brief second, the world felt exactly as it should, simple, steady, safe. But that feeling didn't last, because just beyond the quiet joy of that reunion, something shifted, subtle at first, like a shadow passing over sunlight, the low hum of an approaching engine, the crunch of tires against gravel, and then the presence. Two police cruisers pulling into the lot, their arrival, drawing a few curious glances from nearby parents, though no one thought much of it at first. Not until one of the officers stepped out, his expression firm, his movements deliberate, and began walking directly toward Marcus and Ethan, the air around them tightening in a way that couldn't yet be explained. Marcus noticed immediately, not with fear, but with awareness, the kind that comes from years of reading situations before they unfold. He slowly stood up, keeping one hand gently on Ethan's shoulder, grounding him, protecting him. Even before there was anything visible to protect him from, the officer stopped a few feet away, his eyes fixed, his tone controlled, but edged with something colder beneath the surface. "Sir, I'm going to need you to stay right where you are," he said, and the words hung there, heavier than they should have been, out of place in a setting filled with children and afternoon sunlight. Ethan's small hand tightened slightly around his father's fingers, confusion replacing the joy that had been there just seconds before, and Marcus, still calm, still steady, looked down at him briefly before lifting his gaze back to the officer, not raising his voice, not stepping back, just meeting the moment with a quiet presence that said more than words ever could. "Is there a problem, officer?" he asked evenly, and for a second, no one moved, no one spoke. But something in the air made it clear. This was no longer just another ordinary afternoon. The officer did not answer right away, as if the question itself did not deserve one, his gaze shifting briefly to Ethan before returning to Marcus with a measured scrutiny that lingered just a second too long. "We received a report," he said finally, his voice steady but distant. "And you match the description." The words landed in the space between them like something rehearsed, something impersonal. Yet the way he said it made it feel anything but routine. Marcus remained still, his hand resting lightly on Ethan's shoulder, grounding him as the boy looked up with growing uncertainty. "What description?" Marcus asked calmly, his tone even, controlled, but there was a subtle firmness beneath it now, a quiet insistence on clarity. The second officer stepped closer, positioning himself just off to the side, creating a subtle barrier between Marcus and the rest of the parking lot. And though no one had raised their voice, the shift in positioning did not go unnoticed. Nearby parents began to slow their movements, conversations fading into low murmurs as eyes turned toward the unfolding scene. Ethan's fingers tightened around his father's hand. "Dad, what is happening?" he whispered, his voice small, and Marcus glanced down, offering a reassuring look that did not quite reach his eyes. "It is okay, buddy, just stay with me," he said softly, before lifting his gaze again. The first officer exhaled slightly, as if preparing to move things forward. "Sir, I am going to need you to provide identification," he said, his hand resting near his belt, not aggressive, but firm enough to signal that this was no longer optional. Marcus nodded once, slow and deliberate, and reached carefully into his back pocket, every movement controlled, every gesture intentional. He handed over his wallet without resistance. The officer took it, flipping it open with a quick glance, scanning, then pausing, then scanning again, his expression tightening just enough to suggest something did not align with his expectations. Marcus Reed, he read aloud, almost testing the name. You live around here. The question was casual on the surface, but there was an edge beneath it. Marcus did not react. Yes, he replied simply, and for a brief moment, silence stretched between them, the kind that builds pressure without sound. The second officer shifted his stance, glancing toward the growing number of onlookers, a few phones now visible, held discreetly at chest level, recording, documenting, waiting. The first officer closed the wallet but did not hand it back. Instead, he looked directly at Marcus, his tone sharpening just slightly. I am going to ask you again, sir. What exactly are you doing here? And there it was, the question that did not match the setting. The question that ignored the child standing right there. The backpack, the school, the ordinary moment that had now been pulled into something else entirely. Marcus held his gaze, unshaken, his voice low but clear. I am picking up my son, he said, and Ethan instinctively stepped closer, as if to confirm it without words. But the officer did not look at him this time. He only watched Marcus, as if waiting for something more, something different, something that would justify what was already unfolding. And in that moment, the space between authority and assumption grew thinner, tighter, almost visible in the air. The officer's eyes narrowed slightly, not in confusion, but in quiet resistance, as if the answer he had been given did not fit the version of events he had already decided was true. And for a moment he said nothing, just stood there holding Marcus's wallet, holding the pause, letting it stretch long enough to make the air feel heavier. Step aside for a second, he said finally, his tone shifting from questioning to directive, and though the words were not loud, they carried the weight of expectation. Marcus did not move right away, not out of defiance, but because his son was still holding his hand, still looking up at him with eyes that no longer held excitement, but something else now, something closer to fear. He stays with me, Marcus replied calmly, his voice steady, controlled, but firm in a way that left no room for misunderstanding. The second officer took a small step forward, his posture tightening. Sir, we are trying to handle this quickly. Do not make it harder than it needs to be, he said, and that was when the shift became undeniable, not just in tone, but in intention. Around them the quiet hum of the school pickup had almost completely faded, replaced by the subtle awareness of a situation unfolding. Parents stood a little farther back now, some whispering, others watching in silence, a few still holding their phones, the red recording lights barely visible, but very much present. Ethan tugged gently on Marcus's sleeve. Dad, are we in trouble? He asked, his voice trembling just enough to cut through everything else. And Marcus looked down again, softer this time, lowering himself slightly so he could meet his son's eyes. No, buddy, he said quietly. We are not in trouble. But even as he said it, he knew that what was happening had already gone beyond something simple, beyond something that could be explained away in a sentence. When he stood back up, the officer was already speaking again. Turn around, sir, he said, and the words landed differently this time, sharper, final, the kind that did not invite discussion. Marcus's expression did not change, but something behind his eyes did. Not fear, not anger, something else, something quieter, deeper, like a line being crossed that could not be uncrossed. On what basis? Marcus asked, still calm, still measured, and for a brief second, the officer hesitated, just enough to show that the answer was not as solid as the command. We have probable cause, he replied, though the certainty in his voice did not fully match the situation in front of him. Marcus let out a slow breath, not dramatic, not exaggerated, just enough to signal that he understood exactly what was happening now, and exactly where it was heading. He glanced once more at Ethan, whose small hand was still wrapped tightly around his, and gently, carefully, he knelt down again, bringing himself to his son's level, his voice low enough that only Ethan could hear. Listen to me, he said softly. Stay right here. Okay? I am not going anywhere. Ethan nodded, though his eyes were already beginning to well with tears he was trying hard to hold back. And as Marcus stood once more, he did not resist, did not argue further. He simply turned slowly, deliberately, not because he accepted what was happening, but because he understood something the officers did not, something they had not yet realized. And in that quiet, controlled movement, there was a shift, small, almost invisible, but real, like the first crack in something that was about to break. The moment Marcus turned around, the energy in the parking lot shifted completely, no longer uncertain, no longer quiet, but heavy with a kind of tension that people could feel even if they did not understand it. The first officer stepped closer, guiding Marcus's hands behind his back with practiced precision. His movements controlled and procedural, yet the setting made it feel out of place, almost surreal. A father standing in a school pickup line, now being treated like a threat in front of his own child. Ethan's breath caught, his small voice breaking through the silence. "Dad?" he called out, louder this time, the word trembling as it echoed across the pavement. Several parents turned fully now, their conversations forgotten, eyes fixed on the unfolding scene. One mother instinctively placed her hand over her own child's shoulder, pulling them slightly closer, as if trying to shield them from something they could not yet explain. Marcus remained still, his posture upright, his expression calm, not because the situation was acceptable, but because he refused to let it take something more from him, something deeper, something his son would remember long after this moment passed. "It is okay, Ethan," he said over his shoulder, his voice steady despite the circumstances. "I am right here." But the words felt thinner now, stretched against a reality that was becoming harder to hold. Together, the second officer moved to Marcus's side, his attention shifting briefly to the growing crowd, then back again, as if aware that every second was now being watched, recorded, remembered. "We are going to figure this out at the station," he said. Though the reassurance sounded more like a conclusion than a promise, Marcus did not respond, not verbally, but his silence spoke with its own clarity. His head tilted slightly, just enough to acknowledge the statement without accepting it. Nearby, a phone camera adjusted its angle, capturing the scene from a different perspective, the faint sound of someone whispering, "This does not look right," carried through the air, though no one stepped forward, no one intervened. The weight of authority holding everyone in place. Ethan took a small step forward, his backpack slipping slightly off one shoulder as he reached out instinctively. "Please do not take my dad," he said, his voice fragile but clear enough to cut through everything else. And for a brief moment, even the officers hesitated, just a fraction of a second, but enough to be noticed, enough to reveal that beneath the uniform, there was still a human reaction trying to surface, but it passed quickly, replaced again by procedure, by control, by the need to maintain the version of events already in motion. Marcus turned his head slightly, just enough to catch a glimpse of his son, his eyes softening in a way they had not since the officers arrived. And in that look, there was reassurance, not just for Ethan, but for something larger, something unseen. "Stay with Mrs. Carter," Marcus said gently, nodding toward a teacher standing nearby, her expression tense but compassionate as she stepped closer to Ethan, placing a careful hand on his shoulder. "You will be okay," Marcus added, his voice low but certain. And then, as he faced forward again, something changed, subtle, almost invisible. His shoulders relaxed just slightly, not in surrender, but in control, as if he had reached a decision, as if he understood that what was happening was only the beginning, and that the real moment, the one that would define everything, had not arrived yet. The patrol car door opened with a dull, mechanical sound that seemed louder than it should have been, cutting through the quiet tension that had settled over the parking lot like a storm waiting to break. And as Marcus was guided toward it, the distance between him and his son felt suddenly much greater than a few steps across pavement. It felt like a line being drawn, one that should have never existed in the first place. Ethan stood frozen beside Mrs. Carter, his small hand gripping the fabric of her sleeve as his eyes followed every movement his father made, unwilling to look away, afraid that if he did, something worse might happen, something permanent. Marcus noticed, even without turning fully, he could feel it, that gaze, that fear, and for a brief second, his pace slowed, just enough to anchor himself in that moment, to remind both of them that this was not the end of anything. just a moment passing through. The first officer reached for the back door, holding it open. With a firm, practiced motion, "Watch your step," he said, the words automatic, detached, as if this were any other situation, any other person, but nothing about this was ordinary. Not the location, not the timing, not the quiet presence of dozens of witnesses standing just feet away. Marcus lowered his head slightly as he stepped closer, not in submission, but in thought, in calculation, in a kind of restraint that only comes from understanding the full weight of what is happening and what is about to follow. He paused just before entering, his eyes lifting briefly, scanning the scene one last time. The rows of cars, the scattered parents, the small figure of his son held gently back by someone trying to comfort him without truly knowing how. And then, with a calm that did not match the moment, Marcus spoke, his voice low, controlled, almost quiet enough to miss. "Officer," he said, and the man turned slightly, not expecting anything more than resistance or complaint. "You might want to run that again," Marcus added, his tone even, not threatening, not emotional, just certain. The officer frowned faintly. "Run what again?" he asked, a hint of impatience slipping through. Marcus held his gaze for a second longer, just enough to make the words settle. "My name," he replied, and then he stepped into the car without another word, the door closing behind him with a solid, final sound that seemed to echo far beyond the parking lot. For a moment, everything stood still. The officers exchanged a quick glance, subtle but loaded, as if something about that last sentence had not landed the way it should have. The second officer shifted, looking down briefly at the small device clipped to his vest, then back toward the cruiser, uncertainty flickering just beneath the surface. But it passed quickly, replaced again by routine, by the assumption that whatever this was, it would be sorted out later, at the station, away from the watching eyes, away from the phones, away from the questions that were already beginning to form. But inside the car, Marcus sat quietly, his hands still, his breathing steady, his expression unreadable. And yet beneath that calm, there was movement, not physical, but inevitable, like something already set in motion long before this moment began, something that did not need volume, did not need force, only time. And outside, as the engine started and the cruiser prepared to pull away, one detail remained, unnoticed by most, ignored by others, but very real: the faint vibration of a phone, deep inside Marcus's pocket, a call already going through. The cruiser pulled away from the curb slowly, its tires rolling over the same pavement where moments ago everything had felt normal, and as the school faded into the background, Marcus sat in silence, the faint hum of the engine filling the space where words could have been, but were not needed. His posture remained composed, his gaze steady, fixed forward, not out of submission, but out of control, the kind of control that comes from knowing more than the moment reveals. In the front seat, the two officers exchanged brief, quiet remarks, their voices low enough to blend into the sound of the road. "Dispatch confirmed the call," the second officer said, glancing down at the screen mounted near the dashboard. "Male subject, mid-30s. Suspicious behavior near a school zone." The description hung there, vague, incomplete, yet treated as enough. The first officer nodded slightly, his grip steady on the steering wheel. "We will sort it out when we get there," he replied, more to himself than anyone else, as if repeating it made it more certain. In the back seat, Marcus listened without reacting, not interrupting, not correcting, simply absorbing, his breathing slow, measured, almost rhythmic, as if the chaos of the situation had been filtered out before it could reach him. Outside, the streets of Arlington moved past in quiet sequence, traffic lights shifting from green to red, pedestrians crossing intersections, life continuing exactly as it should, untouched by what was happening inside the vehicle. And yet inside, something else was unfolding, something quieter, something unseen. Marcus shifted slightly, just enough to adjust his position, and for a brief moment, his hand moved closer to his pocket, subtle, almost imperceptible, the faint vibration still there, steady, persistent, a signal waiting to be answered. But he did not reach for it. Not yet. Timing mattered, not urgency, not emotion. Timing. The second officer glanced back through the rearview mirror, his eyes meeting Marcus's for a split second, searching, perhaps expecting frustration, anger, resistance, but finding none, and that absence, that calm, unsettled him more than anything else could have. He looked away quickly, clearing his throat as if to break the silence that had begun to feel too heavy. "You are going to have a chance to explain everything," he said, his tone softer now, almost reassuring, but the words lacked conviction. Marcus finally spoke, his voice quiet. "I already did," he said, and the simplicity of the statement left no room for interpretation, no space for argument, just a truth that had been ignored. The cruiser slowed slightly as it approached an intersection, the red light ahead forcing a brief pause. And in that stillness, something shifted again, the kind of shift that does not announce itself, but changes everything nonetheless. A black SUV turned the corner in the distance, its movement smooth, deliberate, not drawing attention, not yet, but it did not continue. Past, it slowed, matching the cruiser's position, just far enough back to go unnoticed by anyone not looking for it. Inside the patrol car, nothing changed on the surface. The officers remained focused ahead, unaware, but Marcus's eyes moved slightly, just enough to catch the reflection in the side window, just enough to confirm what he already knew. And for the first time since the cruiser left the school, a subtle change crossed his expression, not relief, not satisfaction, something quieter, something deeper, like a clock reaching the moment it had been counting toward all along. The cruiser remained still at the red light, the seconds stretching longer than they should have, as if time itself had slowed to observe what was about to unfold. The low hum of the engine steady, almost calming, but beneath it there was something else now, something shifting just out of view. The first officer tapped his fingers lightly against the steering wheel, a subtle sign of impatience. "Light is taking forever," he muttered, glancing briefly at the intersection ahead, unaware that the moment he was waiting for was not the light turning green, but something far more consequential. Beside him, the second officer adjusted the radio volume slightly, the static crackling softly before settling into silence again. Routine, controlled, predictable, everything about their world still operating under the assumption that this was just another stop, another situation to process and move past. But behind them, that assumption was already beginning to unravel. The black SUV that had slowed moments earlier now moved closer, its presence no longer distant, no longer blending into traffic, its tinted windows reflecting the fading daylight as it positioned itself directly behind the cruiser, not aggressively, not abruptly, but with intention, with precision. Marcus's eyes shifted again, catching the movement through the reflection in the glass, confirming what he had already sensed. His posture did not change, his expression remained composed, but there was a stillness to him now that felt different, heavier, like the calm before something inevitable. The traffic light above flickered from red to green, and the officer's foot pressed lightly on the accelerator, the cruiser beginning to roll forward, but it did not get far. A sharp but controlled sound cut through the moment, not loud enough to startle, but distinct enough to interrupt, the kind of sound that demands attention without raising its voice. The officers both reacted instantly, their eyes shifting toward their mirrors, their focus breaking from the road ahead. The SUV behind them had activated a set of subtle but unmistakable signals, not flashing lights in the traditional sense, but something more official, more deliberate, a quiet assertion of authority that did not need to announce itself loudly to be understood. "What is that?" the second officer asked, his tone shifting, uncertainty slipping in where confidence had been. The first officer slowed the vehicle again, his brows tightening as he glanced back, trying to process what he was seeing. The SUV moved slightly to the side, just enough to be visible, just enough to remove any doubt. And then it happened. The door opened, not rushed, not dramatic, just precise, controlled, and from it stepped a man in a dark suit, his posture straight, his expression focused, the kind of presence that changes a situation without saying a word. He did not raise his voice, did not gesture wildly. He simply walked forward with purpose, each step measured, each movement carrying weight. The officers watched, their confusion deepening into something else. Now, something closer to realization, something they were not yet ready to fully accept. The man approached the driver's side window, stopping just short, and when he spoke, His voice was calm, but it carried a clarity that cut through everything else. "Turn off the engine," he said, and for the first time since this began, the control in the situation shifted completely, not through force, not through volume, but through something far more powerful, something undeniable. And in the back seat, Marcus closed his eyes for just a brief second, not in relief, but in acknowledgement. The moment had arrived. The engine cut off with a soft click, and just like that, the low hum that had filled the cruiser disappeared, leaving behind a silence that felt heavier than any noise, the kind of silence that forces attention, that demands awareness. The first officer's hands remained on the wheel for a moment longer than necessary, his grip tightening slightly as he processed the shift in control. The second officer turned in his seat, his eyes fixed on the man standing just outside the window, uncertainty now fully visible in his expression. The man in the suit did not repeat himself, did not raise his voice. He simply waited, his presence alone enough to hold the moment in place. "Step out of the vehicle," he said calmly, his tone measured, precise, and something in it made it clear that this was no longer a request. The first officer hesitated, just briefly, before opening the door and stepping out. The air outside felt different now, charged in a way that was impossible to ignore. The second officer followed, closing his door more slowly, his gaze flicking between the man in the suit and the black SUV behind them, where two more figures had emerged, equally composed, equally focused. The man in the suit reached into his jacket, not hurried, not aggressive, and produced a badge, holding it just high enough to be seen clearly. "Federal Bureau of Investigation," he said, his voice steady, leaving no room for interpretation. The words landed with quiet force, reshaping the entire scene. In an instant, the officers exchanged a glance, the kind that did not need words to communicate the shift they were both feeling, the assumptions they had made just minutes ago now beginning to unravel, piece by piece. "What is this about?" the first officer asked, his tone no longer firm, but searching. The man in the suit did not look at him right away, his attention shifting instead toward the back of the cruiser, toward the figure seated behind the glass. "Open the rear door," he said, and there it was again, that same calm authority, the kind that does not explain itself because it does not need to. The first officer moved, almost automatically, reaching for the handle and pulling the door open, the movement slower now, more careful, as if aware that every second was being observed, evaluated. Inside, Marcus remained seated, exactly as he had been, composed, still, his eyes lifting to meet the agent's without surprise, without urgency, just acknowledgement. The agent gave a slight nod, subtle, respectful. "Sir," he said, and in that single word, everything changed, not loudly, not dramatically, but completely. The officers heard it, felt it, understood it even before the meaning fully settled in. They looked from the agent to Marcus, and then back again, the realization forming not all at once, but in pieces, each one heavier than the last. The second officer stepped back slightly, his posture no longer rigid, no longer certain. "Wait, who is he?" he asked, the question slipping out before he could stop it. The agent turned his gaze toward him now, calm, unwavering. "You really did not run it again," he said quietly, and then, after a brief pause that stretched just long enough to let the weight of the moment settle, he added, "That is Director Marcus Reed." The words did not echo, they did not need to, they settled into the space around them like something undeniable, something final, and for a second, no one moved, no one spoke. The entire scene held in place by the simple truth that everything they thought they understood just minutes ago had been wrong. For a moment, the world seemed to stop around them, not because anything dramatic had happened, but because everything had already happened, and the truth had finally caught up. The first officer's face shifted first, the certainty that had once anchored his actions now replaced by something far less stable, something closer to realization. His eyes moved back to Marcus, no longer seeing a suspect, no longer seeing a question, but seeing what had been there the entire time, something he had chosen not to recognize. The second officer took another step back, his posture loosening, his hands no longer fixed in place, as if the weight of the situation had quietly lifted off him and settled somewhere else, somewhere heavier, somewhere harder to carry. The agent standing beside the open door did not rush, did not escalate. He simply waited, allowing the moment to unfold fully, allowing the officers to understand what they had done without forcing it upon them. Marcus stepped out of the cruiser with the same calm he had carried from the beginning, his movements measured, controlled, his presence unchanged despite everything that had just occurred. He adjusted his sleeves slightly, not out of habit, but as a quiet reset, a way of reclaiming the moment without needing to announce it. The first officer opened his mouth as if to speak, but no words came out. The language he had relied on earlier no longer fit the situation, no longer carried the same authority. Marcus looked at him, not with anger, not with triumph, but with something far more unsettling, clarity. "You had everything you needed," Marcus said, his voice even, steady, each word landing without force yet carrying weight. "And you chose not to see it." The officer lowered his gaze, not because he was told to, but because he could not hold it anymore. The second officer shifted his stance again, glancing briefly at the agent, then back at Marcus, as if searching for something to say that could undo what had already been done. But there was nothing, no explanation that could return the moment to what it was before, no words that could erase the image of a child watching his father being taken away for no reason other than assumption. Marcus turned slightly, his attention moving past them, beyond the cruiser, beyond the intersection, as if his focus had already moved forward, already decided what mattered next. "My son is still waiting," he said quietly, and that was it. Not an accusation, not a demand, just a statement of truth, one that carried more weight than anything else in that moment. The agent nodded once, already understanding, already moving to make it right. The officers remained where they stood, no longer in control, no longer directing anything. Just witnesses now, witnesses to the consequences of a decision made in seconds, but remembered far longer. As Marcus walked toward the waiting SUV, the late afternoon light catching the edges of his silhouette, there was no rush in his steps, no need for it, because the moment had already spoken for itself. And as he reached the door and paused briefly before getting in, he glanced back once more, not at the officers, not at the cruiser, but at the space where it had all begun. And in that quiet glance, there was something final, something that did not need to be said out loud, because the lesson was already there, written in silence, understood without explanation. He thought he was the law. The moment seemed to whisper, but that day, the law was standing right in front of him.